October 22nd, 1907, and the streets of Lower Manhattan looked like a city that had forgotten how to breathe, because the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest banks in New York, had just announced that it could not pay back its depositors, and within hours panicked crowds were hammering on the doors of every financial institution on Wall Street demanding their money back before the whole system collapsed. And the United States government, without a central bank and without any mechanism to stop the financial bleeding, had absolutely no answer for what was happening, because the single most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere was about to watch its entire financial system dissolve in a matter of days, not because of a foreign invasion and not because of a war, but because ordinary Americans had simply stopped trusting their banks. And the one question every senator, every newspaper editor, and every terrified depositor was asking on that cold October morning was exactly the same. Who is going to save us? The answer was one private banker sitting in his mahogany library on 36th Street in Manhattan, a man named John Pierpont Morgan. And what he did over the next 72 hours did not simply rescue the American economy from total collapse, but also revealed something deeply unsettling about who truly held power in the most powerful country on earth, and whether the story of that power was one of heroism, calculated manipulation, or something far more complicated than either. The story of the House of Morgan does not begin on Wall Street at all, because it begins in Hartford, Connecticut, in the early 1800s, where a merchant family built a reputation for cold-eyed financial discipline that Pierpont Morgan would later turn into something the world had never quite seen before. And what is remarkable about the Morgan family is that they accumulated something far more durable and far more dangerous than money, which was trust. The kind of institutional trust where the Bank of England and the great banking houses of London genuinely believed that if a Morgan partner gave his word on a transaction, that word was as solid as the gold reserves backing it. And Junius Spencer Morgan, Pierpont's father, understood before almost anyone else in America that the real business of banking was not lending money but rather lending credibility, and that if a family could make itself synonymous with financial integrity in the minds of European investors, it could effectively control the flow of capital into a growing continent, and whoever controls the flow of capital into a nation controls, in a very meaningful sense, the nation itself. By the 1880s, Pierpont Morgan had turned this philosophy into something that no one in American history had attempted before, because he began reorganizing the railroads. And understand it this way. Imagine that the entire transportation network of the United States, every train line connecting Chicago to New York, every freight corridor moving grain from the Midwest to the ports of the Atlantic coast, was owned by dozens of competing companies that were simultaneously cutting prices, defaulting on bonds, and destroying each other in suicidal price wars that made all of them weaker and none of them stronger. And now imagine that one man could walk into a room, summon the presidents of all these warring railroads, and say clearly that the ruinous competition stops today, because from now on, prices will be set collectively, territories will be divided rationally, and every bond issued by these railroads will carry the Morgan guarantee, meaning European investors can buy American railroad debt without fear of default. And that is precisely what Morgan did, and what historians now call Morganization. Reshaped approximately 33,000 miles of American railroad by the end of the 1890s, concentrating more economic power in a single private set of hands than any individual citizen had held before in the history of the Republic. But the railroads were only the beginning, because in 1901, John Pierpont Morgan executed something so staggering in its scale that the financial press of London and Paris could barely process what had happened, and that something was the creation of United States Steel, the first corporation in American history valued at more than $1 billion, and Morgan assembled this corporation by buying out Andrew Carnegie for $480 million in gold bonds, which was at that moment the largest single business transaction in human history, and then combining Carnegie Steel with dozens of smaller producers to create one company that controlled 67% of all American steel production. And the question that should make every person listening stop completely is this: when one private bank can reorganize the steel industry of an entire nation over a single weekend, What exactly is the difference between that banker and a king? And what does it say about a democracy when the answer to that question is genuinely difficult to find? And then came October 1907. The panic. And what Morgan did during those 72 hours deserves to be understood in its full detail, because on the night of October 23rd, Morgan summoned the presidents of every major bank in New York to his private library on 36th Street, locked the doors, pocketed the key, and told them plainly that no one was leaving until they had collectively agreed to put up $25 million to stabilize the trust companies that were failing. And they sat in Morgan's library until well past midnight looking at his Renaissance paintings and his leather-bound books while he played solitaire at his desk. And one by one they signed, and President Theodore Roosevelt, who had spent years attacking Morgan as a dangerous monopolist who threatened American freedom, and found himself sending his Treasury Secretary to Morgan's office on Broad Street to ask for help, because the United States government literally did not have enough gold in reserve to stop the bank runs on its own. But here is what the newspapers did not ask loudly enough in 1907, and what a Louisiana congressman named Arsène Pujol finally forced into public view in 1912. If one private banker possesses enough concentrated power to stop a national financial panic that the federal government cannot stop on its own, does that banker hold a degree of authority over the American economy that no private citizen in a democratic republic should ever be permitted to possess? And the Pujol Committee investigation that began in December 1912 revealed something that shocked even veteran journalists who thought they understood how Wall Street operated, because the committee found that Morgan and his partners collectively held 341 directorships in 112 corporations, whose combined resources totaled $22.2 billion. And to understand what that number meant in human terms, consider that the entire federal budget of the United States in 1912 was approximately $1 billion, meaning the Morgan network controlled resources equal to more than 22 years of total government spending. And a New York lawyer named Louis Brandeis, who would later become a Supreme Court justice, called this concentration the money trust, and warned in a widely read book that it was more corrosive to American democracy than any foreign threat the country had ever faced. John Pierpont Morgan died in Rome on March 31, 1913, at the age of 75, and when the news reached Wall Street, the stock market fell immediately, not out of sentiment, but because investors genuinely did not know whether the financial architecture of the United States could function without the man who had been its unofficial central bank for 3 decades. And when Morgan's estate was fully tallied, his personal fortune came to approximately $68 million. And when John D. Rockefeller heard the number, he reportedly said that Morgan was not even a rich man, which reveals something important about the distinction between personal wealth and structural power, because Morgan's real fortune was not counted in dollars, but in the network of trust and obligation that linked every major banking house in London, Paris, Frankfurt, and New York to the Morgan name. And that network did not dissolve with Pierpont's death, because his son Jack Morgan stepped forward and made sure the House of Morgan did not lose a single significant relationship during the transition. Jack Morgan, whose full name was John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., assumed control of the firm in 1913, and within 2 years had executed the single largest financial transaction in the history of the world up to that point. Because when Britain and France went to war against Germany in 1914 and needed to purchase guns, artillery shells, horses, food, and uniforms from American manufacturers on a scale never previously attempted, they turned to the House of Morgan, and the firm became the exclusive purchasing agent for the British and French governments in the United States, eventually directing $3 billion worth of Allied purchases through American factories between 1914 and 1917. And what that number meant in practical terms was that the American economy, which had been struggling warasawam, the agricultural depression and factory unemployment before the war began, was suddenly roaring back to life entirely on the engine of Morgan-directed Allied spending. And a Pittsburgh steelworker named Thomas Grady later told a journalist that he had gone from earning $11 a week in 1913 to $22 a week by 1916, and had no idea that the money flowing into his pay envelope had its ultimate origin in a decision made at a partner's desk in the Morgan offices on Broad Street. By the 1920s, the Morgan firm had built something that went far beyond a bank, because it had become the center of an interlocking web of corporate directorships, so dense and so far-reaching that a Harvard economist named Adolf Berle spent 3 years trying to map it, and eventually concluded that approximately 200 corporations, most of them connected in some meaningful way to either Morgan or Rockefeller, controlled enough of the national economy that their collective decisions could effectively override the signals of the marketplace itself. And the Morgan partners were not hiding this power behind closed doors, because men like Thomas Lamont, who managed the firm's foreign relationships, met openly with heads of state and helped negotiate post-war reparations terms at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and a French diplomat at Versailles reportedly remarked in private correspondence that there were 3 great powers present at the conference: Britain, France, and the Morgan Bank. And then came the Great Depression, and with it a Senate Banking Committee investigation in 1933 that became one of the most extraordinary public spectacles in American financial history, because a small Sicilian-born lawyer named Ferdinand Pecora, serving as chief counsel for the committee, sat across a hearing table from Jack Morgan and his senior partners and began asking questions that the House of Morgan had never been required to answer in public. Questions about the preferred lists that allowed politicians and prominent citizens to purchase Morgan stock offerings at prices far below what ordinary investors paid, and the revelation that Calvin Coolidge, the former President of the United States, had personally been on one of these preferred lists, meaning that the most powerful banking house in America had been distributing financial privileges to sitting and former presidents on a regular basis, caused a sensation in the daily newspapers that even the Morgan partners, long accustomed to operating in a world where their power was understood but never examined openly, found impossible to explain away. And Jack Morgan sat at the witness table for several days looking, as one journalist wrote at the time, like a man who genuinely could not believe that the rules of the world he had always inhabited were changing around him faster than he could respond. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 was the government's formal answer to everything the Pecora hearings had exposed, and what that act did was draw a hard legal line between commercial banking, meaning the accepting of deposits and making of ordinary loans to businesses and families, and investment banking, meaning the underwriting of securities and the arranging of the enormous corporate transactions that had made the House of Morgan legendary. And the partners of J.P. Morgan and Company were compelled to choose between the two businesses, and they chose commercial banking, while a separate group of Morgan partners, including Harold Stanley and Henry Morgan, walked out of 23 Wall Street and formed a new firm called Morgan Stanley. And just like that, the single most consequential financial institution in American history was cleaved in two by an act of Congress. And what should produce a complicated feeling in anyone paying attention is that both pieces adapted, both survived, and by the 1990s, J.P. Morgan and Morgan Stanley combined wielded more aggregate financial power than the original undivided House of Morgan had possessed at its absolute peak, which raises the obvious question of whether the Glass-Steagall solution actually solved the problem it was designed to solve, or simply rearranged it. What does this story actually teach? And is there a lesson here beyond the history of one wealthy family accumulating influence across several generations? The first lesson is the one that matters most. Financial power that operates faster than democratic accountability is genuinely dangerous, not necessarily because the individuals holding it are villains, but because the incentives of private banking and the needs of ordinary citizens do not automatically align. And J.P. Morgan, in 1907, rescued the American economy from a disaster that the government could not prevent. But in doing so, he demonstrated that the economy had been constructed in a way that handed one unelected private citizen the power to either save or destroy it at a moment of his choosing. And a Mumbai accountant named Ram Gupta once said while explaining financial crises to a university audience, that the most dangerous thing any society can do is build systems so complex and so interconnected that only a handful of private specialists can operate them. Because at that point the specialists stop serving the system and the system begins serving the specialists. And the second lesson is that trust, once weaponized by sufficient concentration of power, stops functioning as trust at all and begins functioning as control. J.P. Morgan Chase today is the largest bank in the United States by total assets, with a balance sheet exceeding $3 trillion as of 2024. And Morgan Stanley remains one of the most influential investment firms in the world. And if Pierpont Morgan could somehow survey what his firm became, he would recognize something deeply familiar in its structure: the concentration of key relationships, the centrality to every transaction of national significance, the implicit understanding that certain institutions have grown too large and too interconnected to be permitted to fail, which is precisely the logic the United States government applied in 2008 when it committed $700 billion of public money to rescue the banking system from a crisis that the banking system had itself construed. CTED over many years, and a Chicago financial analyst named David Kaplan said in a widely shared commentary after that bailout that the largest American banks had spent decades privately socializing their risks while publicly capitalizing their profits, which is a formal way of saying that in the 115 years separating the panic of 1907 from the financial crisis of 2008, the fundamental question about who actually runs the American economy, the question that Arsène Pujol asked in 1912 and Ferdinand Pecora asked in 1933, had never been answered in any way that lasted.